The photograph was creased down the middle, worn soft at the edges from being folded and unfolded so many times that the face of the man in it had begun to blur at the corners. But Susan Kendrick knew every line of that face better than she knew her own, and she pressed it flat against her palm as the stagecoach rolled her deeper into the dust and the heat of the New Mexico territory in the summer of 1878. She had been running for 3 days. Not from something, exactly, though there were men in Albuquerque who would have preferred she stay put and grieve quietly, and sell her father's land and move on the way widowed daughters were supposed to move on. She was running toward something. Toward a name. Toward a debt that had gone unpaid for 11 years and had finally come due in the worst possible way. Her father, Thomas Kendrick, had died 6 weeks ago. Not from age, though he had been 54 and the years had not been gentle to him. He had died from the kind of slow suffocation that came from losing everything you had built, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to breathe for. The ranch was gone. The cattle were gone. And at the center of all of it, like a rot that had worked its way into the wood long before anyone thought to check, was the name Harlan Vaughn. Harlan Vaughn had borrowed $4,000 from Thomas Kendrick in the spring of 1867, the same year Susan had been born, the same year the war was still working its poison through the veins of the country and men were making desperate agreements on handshakes and paper. Her father had given the money freely, had trusted Harlan the way men of that era trusted neighbors and fellow veterans, with a faith that was almost religious in its completeness. Harlan had signed a promissory note. He had shaken Thomas's hand. He had ridden away and built something fine and prosperous in the Southern Territory, and he had never once sent $1 back. Thomas had been too proud to chase the debt. Too proud to write letters that felt like begging. He had built his own ranch up again from almost nothing, had raised Susan alone after her mother passed from fever when Susan was only 4 years old, and he had done it with the quiet stubbornness of a man who believed the world eventually corrected itself. It had not corrected itself. The drought years came, then the bad cattle season. Then the bank notes came due, and Thomas had nothing left to pay them with, and the land he had worked for 30 years passed into someone else's hands in a morning. He had shown Susan the promissory note on his deathbed. He had pressed it into her hands with the same careful reverence she now pressed the photograph. "Harlan Vaughn," he had said, and his voice had been a dry thing barely held together. "The note is legal. A judge would honor it, but I never could bring myself to ask, Susan. I never could lower myself to go stand on a man's porch with my hat in my hand." He had paused, breathing with effort. "You're stronger than I was. Go get what's ours." She had kissed his forehead and promised she would try. He had died the following morning with the window open and the early light coming in from the east, and Susan had sat beside him for a long time before she rose and began to prepare for the road. She had inquired about Harlan Vaughn through a lawyer in Albuquerque, a careful, thin-faced man named Pratt who had confirmed that the promissory note was legally binding, and that with a territorial judge's backing she could compel repayment with interest. He had also told her, with the particular tone of a man delivering news he expected to be unwelcome, that Harlan Vaughn had passed away the previous winter. Pneumonia, apparently. Fast, from the sound of it. Faster than he deserved, Susan had thought, though she had not said that aloud. What Pratt had also told her was that Harlan Vaughn's debts and his assets and his estate had passed to his son, his only son. A man named Albert Vaughn, 26 years old, who ran a cattle operation out of a town called Cimarron Wells, a day's ride east of Santa Fe. Susan was 21. She had her father's promissory note folded in her coat pocket and the photograph of Harlan Vaughn, the only one she could locate in her father's things, in her hand. She had $40, a carpetbag with 2 dresses and a change of underclothes, and the kind of purpose that sits in a person's chest like an ember that will not go out. The stagecoach smelled of leather and other people's sweat. Beside her sat a heavy-set woman traveling to meet her married daughter, and across from her rode 2 men in the dusty clothes of working cowhands, who said nothing to anyone, and slept with their hats over their faces. The landscape outside the window was magnificent in the way that things are magnificent when you are too preoccupied to properly appreciate them. Red rock formations rising from flat earth, the sky an enormous blue that had no equivalent anywhere she had ever seen, and the heat sitting on everything like a held breath. She thought about what she would say. She had rehearsed it many times. She imagined a man like his father, heavyset perhaps, self-satisfied, the kind of man who did not think about debts because debts belonged to other people. She imagined the cool, contained voice she would use, the legal language Pratt had written out for her on a card, the steadiness she would maintain even if he tried to dismiss her. She did not imagine what actually happened. Cimarron Wells was smaller than she expected. The main street was perhaps 200 yards of packed dirt running between a general store, a livery, a saloon called the Painted Door, a small hotel, a land office, and a scattering of other establishments that looked like they were still deciding whether to stay. There was a church at the far end that appeared freshly whitewashed, which gave the whole town an odd feeling of optimism. The stagecoach stopped in front of the hotel, and Susan stepped down into the afternoon heat with her carpetbag and her composure, and the photograph still folded in her hand, because she had not yet had occasion to put it away. The hotel was called the Mesa House. It had 8 rooms and a dining room that smelled of beans and coffee and wood smoke, and the woman at the desk, Mrs. Clara Howell, was a broad-shouldered widow of about 50 who looked at Susan the way experienced women in small towns look at young women arriving alone, which was with a combination of curiosity and protective wariness. Just passing through, Mrs. Howell asked, and she said it in the way that was also asking, "What's your business here?" "I have business with Albert Vaughn," Susan said, setting her bag down. "I'd like a room for a few nights if you have one available." Mrs. Howell's expression shifted. Not dramatically, but Susan was observant and she noticed. "Albert," the woman said, as if sorting through her impressions of him. "You a relative?" "No, ma'am, it's a legal matter." Mrs. Howell nodded slowly as if that answered more questions than it raised. "Room 4 is available, $2 a night. Supper's at 7 if you want it." "Thank you." Susan paid for 2 nights in advance, went up to the room, washed her face and hands in the basin, changed into a cleaner dress, pinned her dark hair back from her face, and sat on the edge of the bed for several minutes with the promissory note open on her knee, reading the terms again as if they might have changed. They had not changed. $4,000, dated March the 14th, 1867, signed in Harlan Vaughn's looping hand, witnessed by a man named Greer, whose first name she could not quite make out. With 11 years of interest at the standard territorial rate, the debt had grown considerably. Pratt had calculated it at a figure that made her breath catch: $6,400, more than most men earned in 3 years of honest work. She folded the note back into her pocket and went downstairs to ask Mrs. Howell where she might find Albert Vaughn. The woman's directions took her out of town and half a mile north along a rutted road that ran between hills of sage and dry grass. The Vaughn operation was visible from a distance. A main house built of adobe and timber, solid-looking and well-kept, with outbuildings, a large corral, and a barn that was bigger than anything else in the immediate landscape. There were horses in the corral, and as she came closer on foot she could see the smudge of cattle on the far hillside, and the general atmosphere of a working ranch that knew what it was doing. She had almost reached the gate in the split-rail fence when she heard his voice. He was around the side of the barn, talking to another man, and his voice carried clearly in the dry afternoon air. It was a calm voice, deliberate, with a quality of having thought before speaking that she would later come to recognize as one of his most consistent traits. She could not hear the exact words at first, but the tone was instructive without being overbearing, the voice of a man explaining something he expected to explain only once. She pushed through the gate and walked around the side of the barn. He was standing with his back partly to her, one boot up on the lowest rail of a fence, talking to a sun-darkened man of about 40 who held a coil of rope in both hands. He was tall, lean in the way of men who work with their bodies rather than their vanity, wearing canvas trousers and a plain blue shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. His hat was pushed back on his head, and his hair was dark brown, nearly black, and he had the kind of jaw that looks like it was put there with conviction. When she was close enough that her footsteps on the dry ground could be heard, he turned. She had prepared for his face. She had the photograph, after all, though the photograph was of his father and it was years old and the resemblance might have been stronger or weaker than she expected. It was stronger. He had the same strong brow, the same set to the mouth. But the resemblance stopped at the surface. Where Harlan Vaughn's face in the photograph had a quality of willful carelessness, this face was attentive, and the eyes, which were a light brown that the afternoon sun was turning nearly gold, were the eyes of someone who was actually present in the moment, actually looking at her, actually registering that a woman he had never seen before had walked onto his property with her chin up and her hands steady. "Can I help you?" he said. He did not say it with suspicion. He said it with the straightforward courtesy of a man who had been raised to meet people squarely. "I'm looking for Albert Vaughn," she said. "That's me." She had prepared what came next. She had rehearsed it many times in the stagecoach and the hotel room and the road between. She reached into her coat pocket, withdrew the promissory note, and held it out toward him. "My name is Susan Kendrick," she said. "My father was Thomas Kendrick of Albuquerque. Your father borrowed $4,000 from mine in 1867 and never repaid it. My father is recently deceased, and the debt has passed to me. I have a legally binding promissory note, and I intend to collect what is owed." She had expected several reactions. She had prepared for denial, for aggression, for the kind of polite dismissal that men directed at young women when the subject was money and law. She had not prepared for the way he went very still. It was not the stillness of a man thinking about how to get out of something. It was the stillness of a man confronted with something he already knew and had been waiting to have to face. He took the note from her hand without reaching for it quickly. He unfolded it and read it carefully, and while he read, she watched his face. The other man with the rope had found something else to occupy himself with. It was just the two of them now, with the sound of wind moving through the sage and a horse somewhere near making a soft, restless sound. Albert Vaughn folded the note back along its worn creases and handed it to her. His expression was difficult to read, but it was not hostile, and that surprised her more than anything else had so far. "I know about this debt," he said. She blinked. "You do?" "My father told me about it before he died. He told me a great many things he probably should have said 30 years earlier." He put his boot down from the rail and turned to face her fully. "I'm sorry about your father, Miss Kendrick." The sincerity in the way he said it was unexpected enough that it briefly disrupted her composure. She recovered it. "Thank you. I won't pretend the note isn't valid. It's signed and witnessed and dated, and I have no intention of disputing it." He looked at her steadily. "The question is whether I can pay it in full immediately, which I cannot, or whether we need to work out an arrangement." She had also not prepared for this. She had prepared for a fight, not a conversation. "I see," she said, and heard herself sounding more uncertain than she wanted. "Come inside," he said. "I'll get you something cold to drink and we can talk about it like sensible people." She followed him into the house because it was the sensible thing to do, and because her feet were tired from the road, and the heat was considerable, and there was no tactical advantage to refusing. The inside of the house was cool and surprisingly orderly. The main room had a stone fireplace, a long wooden table, bookshelves that held more books than she expected, and a pair of windows that let the afternoon light fall in pale rectangles across the floor. It was not a prosperous man's display of wealth. It was a working man's home arranged by someone who cared about how things felt, not just how they functioned. He poured 2 glasses of water from a pitcher and set one in front of her at the table. She sat. He sat across from her. "The honest figure with interest," he said. $6,400 by my lawyer's calculation," she said, "at 6% per annum for 11 years. He nodded as if he had already done the arithmetic. I have approximately $4,000 in cash and liquid assets that I can access without selling the property. The rest is in land and cattle." "That's not enough." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone stalling, but the quiet of someone genuinely thinking. "I would propose this. I'll pay you the 4,000 now. For the remaining 2,400, I'll give you a promissory note of my own, payable within 1 year at the same interest rate. You would have my signature and my property as security." She studied him. "How do I know your note is worth more than your father's?" It was a sharp thing to say, and she had said it deliberately, and she watched to see if it would crack his composure. It did not. He met her eyes with the same steadiness he had maintained since she arrived, and something in his expression acknowledged the fairness of the question without flinching from it. "You don't," he said honestly. "I'm not my father, but I have no way to prove that to you in an afternoon. What I can tell you is that this ranch is worth more than twice the remaining debt, and any territorial judge would uphold your claim against it if I defaulted." He paused. "I'd also ask that you understand I'm not trying to escape this debt. My father should have paid it long before now. What he owed was wrong to leave unpaid, and I've known that for years." Susan looked at the glass of water in front of her. She looked at the bookshelves. She looked at his hands flat on the table, the working man's hands, honest-looking in the way that hands often told you things faces could conceal. "I'll need to stay in town while I consider the arrangement," she said. "That's reasonable. I'm at the Mesa house. I want to see the arrangement in writing with your signature before I agree to anything." "Of course." He paused. "Will you eat supper here? There'll be food shortly, and it's a long walk back in this heat." She meant to say no. She had intended to maintain a clean and professional distance between herself and this situation until it was resolved. But the light was beginning to shift toward evening, and Mrs. Howell's dining room didn't open until 7, and she had not eaten since the stagecoach, and the beans and coffee and smoke she could already smell from somewhere at the back of the house were doing something persuasive to her resolve. "I'll stay for supper," she said. "Thank you." The cook was a Mexican woman named Dolores who was in her 50s, and treated Albert Vaughn with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had known him since he was small, and who looked at Susan across the kitchen with the same species of protective curiosity that Mrs. Howell had demonstrated, though Dolores' version included more warmth and less wariness. The meal was beans and salt pork and cornbread, and a tomato and onion salad that was simple and perfect, and they ate it at the long table with the light dying outside the windows and a single oil lamp burning between them. They did not talk about the debt during supper. It happened naturally, without agreement. They talked instead, and Susan found this harder to manage than the debt negotiation had been, because talking was where the person behind the negotiations became visible, and she had not accounted for him being interesting. He had read more than she expected. He asked her what books she had with her, and when she told him she'd brought a copy of Middlemarch that she'd read twice already, he said he'd tried Eliot and found her brilliant but exhausting, and she laughed before she could help it, because that was precisely the right description, and no one had ever said it to her before. He asked about her father, and she told him Thomas Kendrick had been a cattleman and a reader and a man who believed fiercely in fair dealing, and the observation cost her more composure than the legal conversation had. He listened without trying to fill the silences, which she also did not expect. She asked how long he had run the ranch alone. Since his mother had left when he was 14, he told her, and his father had been present in body but absent in the ways that mattered. He'd effectively been managing the operation since he was 18, first for his father, then after Harlan died the previous December for himself. He said it without bitterness, which was either genuine equanimity or a very accomplished performance. She was inclined, against her intentions, to believe it was genuine. When she rose to leave, he walked her to the road. Sky above them was extraordinary, as it always was in the New Mexico territory once the sun went down, a purple-black salted with stars that seemed too close to be real, and the air had cooled from a furnace to something almost gentle. She had her carpetbag over one arm and the promissory note in her pocket and $40 - $2 in her purse. "I'll have the written proposal ready tomorrow," he said at the gate, "if you want to come by." "I'll come in the morning," she said. "Around 10. He nodded. There was a pause that was not exactly awkward and not exactly comfortable, the kind of pause that belongs to two people who have said more than they planned to and are taking stock of that fact. "I am sorry," he said again, "about your father. He was a good man," she said, and her voice held steady, though only just. "He deserved better than he got." "Yes," Albert Vaughn said simply, and he said it as though he had carried some version of that knowledge for a long time. "He did." She walked back to town under the enormous sky and tried to sort out what had happened, and found that it did not sort cleanly into the shape she had brought with her. She slept better than she had in weeks. In the morning she dressed in her better dress, a dark green cotton that her father had always said suited her, and she walked back to the Vaughn ranch with the risen sun at her back and the sage sparkling with the small amount of dew that the desert permitted. She was early. It was not quite 9:30 when she came through the gate, and the ranch was already in motion, cowhands moving between the barn and the corrals, horses being led and saddled, the whole operation in its morning rhythm. Albert was at the corral, watching two of his men work a young horse that had not yet decided it wanted to be ridden. He had his arms folded on the top rail and his hat pulled down against the morning sun, and he was watching the horse with the focused patience of a man who understood that patience was itself a kind of action. He heard her footsteps and turned, and there was something in the way his expression changed when he saw her that she filed away and tried not to look at too directly, the way you don't look directly at something bright. "You're early," he said, but he said it like it was a fact and not a complaint. "I woke up early. Come inside when you're ready. I have everything written up." She stood at the fence for a moment beside him and watched the young horse, which was a sorrel with a white marking on its nose, circle and balk and circle again. "What's wrong with it?" she asked. "Nothing wrong with it," he said. "It's a 2-year-old that hasn't been handled much. It'll come right." He watched the horse, and then he said, without looking at her, "My father never handled things right either. He was better at acquiring things than he was at taking care of them once he had them." She wasn't certain whether he meant the horse or the debt or something larger. She didn't ask. They watched the horse for a few more minutes, and then she followed him inside. The written proposal was clear and fair, and she could not find anything in it to object to. $4,000 in cash, to be paid within 2 weeks pending her agreement, and a promissory note for the remaining $2,400 at 6% per annum, due in full within 12 months, secured against the property. He had also included a clause she had not expected, an acknowledgment of fault on behalf of Harlan Vaughn's estate, which served no legal purpose she could think of but which meant something anyway. She read it twice. He sat across the table and let her read without speaking, which she appreciated. "The acknowledgment of fault," she said, touching that section. "My father should have said it years ago. The least I can do is have it written down." She looked up from the document. He was watching her with that light brown gaze that had a quality of attending to things fully, of not performing attention but actually giving it. She found, not for the first time, that it was difficult to look at him for too long without feeling something shift in her chest. "I'll agree to the terms," she said. He extended his hand across the table, and she shook it, and his grip was firm and brief, and he released her hand without lingering, and she told herself that the warmth she felt was simply the fact of a resolution after weeks of tension and grief and journey, and that it had nothing to do with the particular way his hand had felt around hers. They signed the documents. He gave her a receipt for the agreement and told her the $4,000 would come in banker's draft within 2 weeks, which meant a trip to Santa Fe, where his account was held. She said that she would stay in Cimarron Wells until the initial payment was made, and then she would return to Albuquerque to manage her father's final affairs. That was the plan. It was a reasonable plan. It began to be disrupted almost immediately. The following morning she was having coffee in the dining room of the Mesa house when a woman came in who was clearly not passing through and was clearly looking for her. She was perhaps 35, handsome in a practical way, with the particular confidence of someone who knew everyone in this town and most of their business. She introduced herself as Helen Marsh, the wife of the Cimarron Wells land office agent, and she had the quality of a woman who organized things and people as a matter of course and found it natural to extend this activity to recent arrivals. "Albert Vaughn's business brought you here," Helen said, not asking, settling across from Susan with the ease of someone who had been invited. "It's a legal matter," Susan said carefully. "Everything out here is a legal matter if you wait long enough." Helen poured herself coffee from the pot on the table with the confidence of a woman in her own kitchen. "He's a good man, you know. Spent years cleaning up after his father's choices." The old man was charming and useless in equal measure. Albert's different. Susan looked at the woman and tried to determine what she was actually saying. "I'm sure he is," she said neutrally. Helen studied her with the frankness that small-town women sometimes possessed. "You're staying a few more weeks, until my business is concluded. Then you should come to the social on Saturday. Mrs. Abernathy hosts one every month over at the church hall. Everyone comes." She paused. "Albert generally comes." "I'm not here for socials," Susan said. Helen smiled the smile of someone who had heard that particular sentence before and knew what it was usually followed by. "Of course not." Susan went to the social on Saturday. She told herself it was because sitting alone in a hotel room for weeks was no way to spend time, and because Mrs. Howell had mentioned it as well, and there was clearly some local expectation of attendance, and because there was nothing else to do in the evenings except read Middlemarch for the third time. The church hall was warm with oil lamps and the sound of a fiddle player working through something cheerful. There were perhaps 60 people, which was more than she would have expected from a town this size, but apparently the surrounding ranches and homesteads contributed their populations on social evenings, and the result was a crowd that was varied in age and purpose and social station, and was, at its core, made of the same thing: people who lived in a hard country and had decided to be glad of each other's company. Albert was there. She saw him before he saw her, and she used the moment to look at him in the context of the people around him, which told you things about a person that talking one-on-one could not. He was easy with people, stopping to talk with an older rancher, crouching down to say something to a small child who had grabbed his sleeve, laughing genuinely at something a young woman said to him without any of the performed gallantry of men who thought laughing at women's jokes was a strategy. He was, she saw clearly, someone the people here trusted and liked, and not in the provisional way that people like the powerful, in the way that people like someone they have known to be consistent. When he saw her, he crossed the room. "Miss Kendrick," he said, and he looked genuinely pleased in a way that was simple and unguarded, which made it worse. "I didn't know you were coming. Mrs. Marsh persuaded me," she said. "Helen is very persuasive." He smiled, and there it was, the thing she had been carefully not cataloging, the way his whole face changed when he smiled, the warmth of it. "Can I get you something? There's lemonade or there's punch, and the punch is stronger than it looks, so I'd recommend knowing that going in." "Lemonade, thank you." They stood together with their lemonades and watched people dance, and she learned that the fiddle player was named Marcus, who was 60-something and had been playing at every social in Cimarron Wells since before the war, and that the couple dancing with particular enthusiasm in the center of the floor had been married 3 weeks ago, and were still at the stage of finding everything about each other delightful, and that Helen Marsh's husband Robert was a slow, cautious man who would have been lost without his wife, which Albert said with genuine affection rather than condescension. He told her about the town, and she asked questions that she told herself were simply the questions of someone making use of the time available to her, and he answered with the easy knowledge of a man who had grown up here and paid attention. At some point in the evening they danced. It was not planned. The fiddle moved into a waltz, and several couples moved to the floor. And somehow in the natural flow of the conversation she found herself saying yes when he asked. And they danced. And he was a better dancer than she expected, which she probably should have stopped expecting to be surprised by anything about him. He held her correctly with the proper distance, with his hand warm at her waist, and they moved through the slow turns of the waltz, and she was aware of his nearness with a specificity and warmth that she was done pretending was simply the warmth of the room. "You're a good dancer," she said, because she needed to say something. "My mother taught me before she left," he said. "Said it was the one thing she was certain I'd thank her for." Was she right? "Tonight she is," he said, and his eyes met hers with the directness that was his most characteristic quality, and it meant what it meant, and they both knew it. They did not speak of it directly. The evening ended, people dispersed into the good dark, the fiddle packed up, lamps were extinguished one by one. He walked her back to the hotel as the proper thing to do, and they walked slowly in the full summer night with the stars performing their extravagance overhead. At the door of the Mesa house he said, "I'll be going to Santa Fe on Tuesday to arrange the bank draft. I expect to be back by Thursday." "That's fine," she said. "I'll bring the draft directly to you when I return." "Thank you." Another one of those pauses that held more than it said. The night air was cool, and the street was empty, and somewhere a dog was making a distant comment about something. "Susan," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and he said it as if he'd been turning it over, deciding whether to use it. "I'd like to continue talking to you after this business is settled. If you'd be willing." She looked at him in the lamplight from the hotel's front window and thought about her father on his deathbed and the promissory note and the road she had traveled and the shape of her life, which had been heading in one direction for 21 years and now had something different in it. "I think I would be willing," she said. His smile in the dark was quiet and certain, the way the best things are. He left for Santa Fe on Tuesday. She knew he had gone because the ranch was quieter when she walked past it that afternoon on no particular errand, and because Mrs. Howell told her so over breakfast with the gentle informational delivery of a woman who was keeping careful track of things. Susan spent the days of his absence in ways that she would not have predicted for herself when she arrived. She helped dolers in the kitchen on Wednesday morning when she stopped by to verify a document detail, and was recruited into vegetable chopping before she'd quite decided how that had happened. She had a long conversation with Robert Marsh in the land office about the territorial legal situation regarding inherited debt, which was both practically useful and genuinely interesting. She walked the edges of the town in the evenings and watched the light do what it did to the rock and sky in this part of the world, which was something she had not had sufficient attention for when she first arrived. He came back on Thursday, as promised. She heard the horse in the late afternoon and looked up from the book she was reading on the hotel's small porch, and he came down the main street with the dust of the road on him, and saw her on the porch, and something in his face settled like a man arriving somewhere he had been thinking about. He brought her the bank draft Friday morning. They sat at the hotel's dining room table, which was empty at that hour, and he slid the draft across the table with the same directness he'd brought to everything. $4,000. She looked at it for a moment, this piece of paper that represented years of her father's work and worry and quiet grief, and she felt the weight of it pass through her. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "It should have been done years ago," he said. "Yes," she folded the draft carefully. "It should have." She lifted her eyes to his. "My father would have been grateful not just for the money, for the acknowledgement of fault. He would have needed that more than the money, I think." Albert was quiet for a moment. Then, "My father didn't like owing things. It made him feel small, and he didn't have much tolerance for feeling small. So he just didn't think about it." He looked at his hands on the table. "That's not an excuse." "No," she said, "it's not. I know." There was something comfortable now in the silences between them, the way comfort develops in the gaps of conversation when the conversations themselves have been honest. She noticed this and thought about it. "I had planned to leave for Albuquerque once the initial payment was made," she said. He looked at her with a steady gold-brown gaze. "Had planned," he said. "Yes. And now," she folded her hands on the table. She had never been a person who talked around things when she could speak plainly, which was one of the things her father had passed on to her most directly. "And now, I find that I am less certain about the timeline," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "I have a room at the ranch that's been used as a sewing room for years and hasn't been used for sewing since my mother left," he said. "It would make a reasonable sitting room. A person could read in it or sit in the mornings when the light is good." "That's a very specific thing to mention." "I'm a specific person," he said. She laughed. She had been doing that more than she expected to. "I'll think about it." She thought about it for 2 days, and then she moved her 2 dresses and her carpetbag and her copy of Middlemark out to the Vaughn Ranch, into the room that had been a sewing room and had good morning light. And she told herself, this was a practical arrangement for a woman who needed to be in the vicinity for the remaining debt negotiation and the follow-up legal matters, and she believed approximately half of that explanation. Dollars looked at her when she arrived with the carpetbag and said, "Good," in a tone that suggested she had been expecting this outcome and was satisfied with the schedule. She had been at the ranch for a week when the man named Denton arrived. Burl Denton was 40 years old and owned land adjacent to the Vaughn property on the eastern side, and he had been involved in a boundary dispute with Harlan Vaughn for years, a dispute which had not been formally resolved and which had, apparently, been his expectation to resolve more favorably now that the old man was gone and the son was running things. He came on a morning when Albert was out in the eastern pasture, and Susan was in the sitting room with the good light reading, and Dollars showed him in with the precise courtesy of a woman who did not trust him but would not be rude. He looked at Susan in the sitting room with surprise that shifted quickly into a calculating assessment that she did not like. "I didn't know Albert had company," he said. "I'm staying here temporarily on a matter of business," she said, putting her book down. "What business?" "My own," she said pleasantly. He was a large man with the kind of broadness that had been muscle once and was drifting toward something softer, and he had the eyes of someone who was used to getting the measure of things quickly in order to use that information to his advantage. He looked around the room as if taking inventory. "Albert know you were coming to stay here, or did that happen after?" he said. Susan stood up. She was not a tall woman, but she had her father's quality of occupying space with authority, and she used it now. "Is there something I can help you with, Mr. Denton, or would you prefer to wait for Albert outside?" He smiled in a way that was not warm. "I'll wait outside." She watched him go, and then she sat back down and picked up her book, though she did not read it, and she was aware of a low uneasiness that she did not entirely have words for yet. When Albert came in from the pasture, she told him Denton had been by and was waiting in the yard, and she watched Albert's expression go through something brief and unfond before he composed it. "The boundary dispute," he said. It was not quite a question. He seemed interested in more than that. Albert looked at her. "What do you mean?" He asked what my business was with you. He was trying to work out what leverage he had. She paused. "Be careful with him." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had not seen on him before, something that recognized her specifically for the particular sharpness she was offering. "Thank you," he said, and went out. She listened to the exchange from the window, not deliberately eavesdropping but not walking away either. Denton's voice was easy and big, the kind of voice that expected rooms to accommodate it. Albert's voice was even and measured, giving nothing. The dispute was about 300 yards of fence line and the water access it controlled. Denton claimed it was his by a survey done in 1871. Albert said the survey was disputed, and he had the original deed language. Denton said he'd take it to the land office and beyond if necessary. Albert said that was his right. The exchange ended without agreement but also without escalation, and Denton rode away the way he had come. Albert came back inside and stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "His survey is fraudulent. Robert Marsh has already confirmed it, and I have a proper survey coming from Santa Fe." "I thought as much," Susan said. He looked at her with the corner of his mouth moving again. "How did you know?" The way he looked at the room, he was appraising what he thought he might be able to take. Albert was quiet for a moment. "You have a gift for reading people," he said. "My father could not do it at all," she said, and there was something both fond and sad in her voice. "I think I developed it to compensate." He came and sat down at the kitchen table, and Doler set coffee in front of him without being asked, and he wrapped his hands around the cup and was quiet in the way he was quiet when he was genuinely thinking rather than pausing for effect. "I want to tell you something," he said. She sat down across from him where she had begun to naturally sit, the way a person's place at a table establishes itself through repetition. "When my father was dying," he said, "he told me about the Kendrick debt. He said it had been wrong to leave it. He said he'd kept meaning to deal with it and kept finding reasons not to. He was crying when he told me." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "I had never seen my father cry. He was not a man who did that. And I thought, this is what it takes. A man has to be dying to admit to the things he should have said." He looked up from the cup. "I didn't want to be that kind of man. I've been thinking about that since I was 18. Whether I could be a different kind of man than he was." He paused. "I think I can be. I'm certain I want to be." The light in the kitchen was the midday light, direct and clear, and it fell across his hands and the cup and the table between them. And Susan looked at this man she had come here to collect a debt from and found that the debt was the least interesting thing about him. "I think you can be," she said. "I have fairly good evidence of it so far." He met her eyes. "So far," he agreed, with a gravity that held warmth inside it. It was 2 weeks later in the evening that he kissed her for the first time. They had been sitting on the front porch in the cooling dark, and she had been telling him about her father's ranch, and the way it looked in the early mornings when the dew was on the grass, and the cattle were just shapes in the distance. And she had become more specific and more emotional than she intended, which happened when she was tired and her guard came down, and he had been listening to her in his complete way. And when she finished talking, he reached over and took her hand, just held it, said nothing. And they sat like that for a while with the stars doing their vast slow work overhead. And then he said very quietly, "May I?" And she turned toward him and said, "Yes." And he kissed her, soft and certain, the way he did everything, and it was not dramatic in the way of novels, which she had enough experience with novels to know was actually a better sign than the dramatic versions. They separated and the night came back in around them, the crickets and the horse sounds and the distant soft complaint of cattle. "I have been trying to be proper about this," he said. "You've been very proper," she said. "I didn't want you to think I was taking advantage of the situation." She looked at him in the dark. "Albert, I am 21 years old and I walked into a strange man's ranch in the middle of the New Mexico territory with a legal document and no plan except my own stubbornness. I'm not someone who gets taken advantage of." He laughed, and it was a full sound, real and warm, and it went straight into her chest and made a home there. "No," he said, "you are absolutely not." After that, things between them were different in the way that things are different when an unspoken truth gets spoken. Lighter, and more serious at the same time, because acknowledged things carry more weight than hinted ones. She wrote to the lawyer Pratt in Albuquerque to explain the arrangement and confirm the receipt of the bank draft. She also wrote to the man handling her father's estate to say that she would be delayed in returning, and that he should proceed with the sale of the remaining estate goods as previously discussed. These were the practical matters. The less practical matter was that she was falling in love with Albert Vaughn in a way that had moved past the stage of useful denial into something she had simply stopped arguing with. She saw it in small things and large ones. The way he argued with her about Elliot and was wrong about Elliot, but argued with genuine engagement. Not the condescending argument of a man who doesn't quite believe a woman can hold a position. The way he handled his cowhands, with respect and directness, paying them fairly, learning their family situations, treating them as men with lives rather than labor to be deployed. The way he dealt with the boundary dispute with Denton, which was steadily and legally and without drama, and which was eventually resolved in his favor when the proper survey came from Santa Fe and confirmed what he had said all along, and he simply had the fence adjusted and did not say a word to Denton that was not necessary. She saw it in the way he was with the land itself, the way he walked it in the early mornings sometimes, and she began joining him, and he would point out things, the way the soil had changed here, the route the water took after rain, which grasses were coming in from overgrazing, and how to manage them. He loved this place in the practical, non-sentimental way of someone who had made their peace with loving something difficult because the alternative was not loving it. She also saw it in the way he was with her, specifically, the way he took her seriously in a time and place where that was not automatic, where women were respected in certain prescribed ways and resented in others, and the world of commerce and law was considered not their domain. He never made her feel that the domain was not hers. He consulted her, he asked her opinion. When she was right about something he said so directly, and when he disagreed he said that directly too, and they would argue it out to whatever resolution it actually reached, and she found this to be one of the best things about him. Late August arrived with a heat that was more serious than what had come before, and the ranch was in full operational push as they prepared for the fall cattle drive. Albert was busy in the way that men become during those weeks, present at meals and in the evenings, but otherwise occupied from first light until the last of it, and Susan found herself absorbed into the operations of the ranch, in a way she had not anticipated, helping dolers manage the increased cooking needs for the extra hands, keeping the supply records that she had offered to take over when she saw how scattered they were. Spending long afternoons in the sitting room with the good light doing the quiet accounting work that she had grown up watching her father do, and had absorbed without knowing she was absorbing it. One evening in late August after supper, when the hands had gone to their bunkhouse and dolers to her quarters and the house was quiet around them, Albert came and sat beside her on the front porch where she had taken to reading in the evenings, and he was quiet for a while, and then he said, "I need to say something to you, and I want to say it properly." She put her book down. "When you arrived here 2 months ago," he said, "you had every right to be angry. You had every right to treat this as purely a transaction and me as the bad end of it." He was looking at the dark hills in the distance. "You didn't do that. You were fair. You were more than fair. You were." He paused as if selecting the word precisely, honest in a way that I have not had very much of in my life. He turned to look at her. "I don't want you to leave," he said. "That's what I need to say. I know you have things to handle in Albuquerque. I know your life was there. I know this is." He spread a hand at the ranch, the night, the whole situation, not what you came here for. She looked at the hills he had been looking at and thought about Albuquerque, which held her father's grave, and a rented room she had barely occupied, and a lawyer's office where a bank draft was waiting to be deposited. She thought about the ranch, which held the scent of sage and coffee and books, and the mornings when they walked together, and the way the whole territory looked in the early light from the window of the former sewing room. "I should go to Albuquerque," she said. "I have my father's affairs to settle properly. The estate, the grave, things I've been putting off." She looked at him. "I should go, and then I should come back if you're asking me to." He exhaled slowly, as if something that had been held tightly was releasing. "I'm asking you to," he said. "Then I will." He took her hand in the dark, and they sat together for a long time while the night moved around them, and the stars did their slow circuit, and somewhere out in the dark a coyote made its lone, carrying sound. She left for Albuquerque the following week. The stage carried her west in the morning heat, and she watched the rock and sage pass and thought about the road the first time, when she had held the photograph and the promissory note, and had been made of determination and grief, and she thought about the road now, which carried her toward something but also back toward something she was going to return from, which was a different kind of travel entirely. In Albuquerque she stayed at a boarding house and spent 2 weeks doing the necessary work. She met with Pratt and deposited the bank draft and had him confirm the terms of the remaining debt arrangement. She visited the cemetery where her father had been buried in a simple service, and she sat beside the headstone for a long time and told him what had happened, not all of it, but enough, the payment, the acknowledgement of fault, the arrangement for the rest. She thought he would have approved of the arrangement. She thought he would have found the irony of the whole situation either amusing or precisely just, depending on his mood, and she smiled at the stone and said she was going back now and she would be all right. She sorted her father's remaining possessions. There was not much. A few books she kept. Some letters she kept. His tools she let go, the saddle equipment, the farming implements, things that needed to be used by working hands and not stored in boxes. She kept his hat, which she had no practical use for but could not leave behind. She wrote to Albert twice while she was there. Not long letters, practical ones because she was a practical person. The first one told him that the bank arrangements were confirmed, and the estate was proceeding, and she expected to be back within 3 weeks. The second one was shorter and less practical, and she wrote it late at night at the small desk in her boarding house room with the lamp burning low and the sounds of the city outside. I think about the morning walks and the fact that you disagree about George Eliot without really knowing why you disagree, which is half your charm and half the point where I could argue you into the ground. I'll be back before the end of September. The range will still be the same color by then. I checked. Save the good coffee for when I arrive because the coffee here is terrible. She folded it and posted it before she could reconsider the less practical parts. His reply was waiting for her at the Albuquerque post office 3 days later, which meant he had written within a day of receiving hers. The mornings are better when there's someone to walk with who notices the things I've stopped noticing because I've seen them too long. I've been wrong about Eliot, and I'm willing to be argued to the ground if it means another argument with you. I have dollars saving the good coffee. The range is the same color, but it looks different than it did before you got here, and I expect it looks different still from how it'll look when you're back. Come back soon. She read it twice, and then folded it and put it in her coat pocket with the promissory note, which she had never quite moved out of that pocket, and she was honest with herself that she was happy. She came back to Cimarron Wells on the 23rd of September, on the afternoon stage, and Albert was at the hotel when she arrived, which was not where he usually was on a Tuesday afternoon, and she looked at him standing on the porch of the Mesa house, and thought that the range did look different than it had when she first came, though the difference was not in the range. He said, "You made it," and she said, "I made it." And then he stepped off the porch and came to her and took her carpetbag without asking, and she let him. The autumn in the New Mexico territory was its own particular beauty, different from the summer but not less, the light going gold in a different register, the mornings colder, the evenings sharper, and the cattle operation in its harvest season rhythm. Susan settled back into the ranch with the ease of returning to something that had been waiting for her. Dollars made it plain that Susan's help in the kitchen had been missed, not in terms of the cooking, which Dollars needed no help with, but in terms of company. "This man," she said, indicating Albert with a tip of her head, "talks very little." "He talks plenty," Susan said. "To you," Dollars said, as if this were the precise point. The remaining debt fell due in stages that Albert managed carefully and met fully, each payment accompanied by a receipt and a brief formal acknowledgement that they both observed for the sake of the legality, and then set aside because it was not the real substance of things. By the end of October, the debt was half settled. By the end of November, it was 3/4. In November, he asked her to marry him. They were on the morning walk, which by November meant hats and coats and their breath in the cold air, and the sage was silver gray with the frost, and the hills were lit at the tops where the early sun had reached. He stopped walking in the middle of the trail, which was not the way he usually moved, and she stopped too, and he was looking at the hills, and then he looked at her. "I want to marry you," he said. "I have for a while. I kept not saying it because there was the debt and the arrangement, and I didn't want any part of this to look like something other than what it is." "What is it?" she asked. "It's the fact that you walked onto this property in August with nothing but a legal document and complete conviction, and turned out to be the most honest person I've met since my mother left," he said. "It's the fact that I have wanted to talk to you every morning since the morning I met you. It's the fact that I love you, Susan, and I want you to be my wife, and I want to know what you want." The morning was cold and clear, and the frost was on everything, and he was looking at her with the specific gravity that was entirely his, and she thought about what it was to know a person, really know them, the kind of knowing that came from watching them handle difficulty and disappointment and ordinary days, and she knew Albert Vaughn in that way, the way that lasted. "Yes," she said, "I want to." He exhaled again in that way he had, the particular way of releasing what had been held, and he stepped toward her and put his arms around her, and she put her face against his shoulder, and the cold morning went on around them, the frost and the silver sage and the enormous pale sky. The winter settled in, not the ferocious winter of the northern territories, but the dry, cold nights and bright cold days of the high desert, and they married in December. The wedding was in the church at the end of the main street, the whitewashed one she had noticed on her first day in Cimarron Wells, and it was small in the way of practical people, attended by dolers and the ranch hands and Helen and Robert Marsh and Mrs. Howell, and a handful of other townspeople who had, over the months, become the community in which she lived. The minister was a young man named Beauchamp who had been in Cimarron Wells for only a year, and conducted the service with nervous earnestness that was somehow more moving than confidence would have been. Albert stood at the front of the church in the best shirt he owned, which was clean and pressed and a dark blue that suited him, and when she came down the aisle on Robert Marsh's arm, because Robert had offered, and because she had no one else, and because he meant it genuinely, Albert looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before and would spend years getting to know, the expression of a man entirely open, entirely present, entirely unguarded. They said the words in front of the minister and the small assembled gathering and the cold December light coming through the plain glass windows, and when the minister said he could kiss his bride, Albert did so with the same quietness and certainty that characterized everything about him, and the people in the pews responded with warmth. The celebration was at the Mesa House dining room, which Mrs. Howell had set up with particular care, and there was food and the fiddle player Marcus, who had apparently never missed a significant Cimarron Wells occasion in living memory, and there was dancing, and when she and Albert danced together, it was different from the first time at the social, not better or worse but deeper, with the weight of everything that had happened between that evening and this one. Helen Marsh caught Susan's hand at the end of the evening and held it briefly and said, "I knew it the morning you arrived and told me it was a legal matter. I've never seen anyone so entirely determined about a legal matter." "It was a legal matter," Susan said. "And then," Helen said, smiling. "And then," Susan agreed. "The winter passed. The ranch's spring operations began in earnest in March, and Susan had moved into the ranch's bookkeeping completely by that point, a natural evolution of the supply records she had taken over the previous year, and she found she was good at it in the way you are good at things you care about doing well. Albert had not asked her to take it on. She had done it because it needed doing and she could do it, and because having meaningful work made her a better person to live with, which she knew about herself. The last payment on the debt came in March. Albert handed her the final certified bank receipt across the breakfast table with the quiet formality they had observed throughout the process, and she took it and filed it and then looked at him. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. She picked up her coffee. He picked up his. Outside the window the early spring was beginning in the desert, the sage putting up its new growth, and the morning light on the far hills. "My father would have been relieved," she said. "And then he would have felt guilty for being relieved. Your father sounds like a decent man." He was. She looked at her coffee. He gave that money to your father because your father was in trouble and he had it to give and he believed in people. He didn't give it because he expected a return. He gave it because it was right." She looked up. The money wasn't the point. It was never the point. Albert was quiet for a moment. Then what was the point? She thought about it. That someone acknowledged the wrong, she said. That it was named and addressed. He needed it named even if he never said so, and he never got that while he was alive. She folded her hands on the table. But it was named. You named it. You put it in writing. And the debt is paid and the fault is acknowledged, and my father's ranch may be gone, but his word means something and his name is clean. Albert reached across the table and covered her folded hands with one of his own. His daughter's here, he said. That's his best legacy. She was done then with the careful composure, and she let it go, and what came instead was something simpler, just the fact of being known and loved and in the right place. She wrote her father's name in the ranch ledger that spring, in the column she had labeled settled accounts. Thomas Kendrick, debt acknowledged, debt paid. She kept the ledger under the desk in the sitting room, the one with the good morning light. Spring turned toward summer, and life in Cimarron Wells moved in the rhythm she had come to know. The ranch operations, the town socials, the morning walks, the evenings on the porch with books and arguments, and the comfortable proximity of two people who had chosen each other and were daily glad of it. The news she confirmed in July surprised neither of them, though she told him with the same directness she brought to everything, one morning over coffee, matter of fact and warm. He was quiet for a moment, and then he stood up from the table and came around it and held her the way a man holds something he cannot quite believe is real, and she felt his face against the top of her head and his breath steady and slow. "A baby," he said. "In the spring, I think," she said. He held her for a long time and said nothing more, because he was a man who knew when words were less than the thing itself. Dolores, upon being told, said only, "Good," in the same tone she had used when Susan first arrived with the carpetbag, the tone of a woman who knew how stories were meant to go. The pregnancy moved through its months in the practical, imperfect, ordinary way that pregnancies do, and Susan continued her ledger work and her morning walks and her arguments about literature, though the walks got slower in January, and she developed strong opinions about which foods were acceptable that Dolores accommodated with the serene flexibility of someone who had been feeding people for decades. Albert did not hover. This was something she had been mildly afraid of, the overcaution of a man who loved her becoming constrained, but he trusted her in the same direct way he trusted her judgment about everything else, was present when she wanted him and available when she needed him, and did not treat her as though she had become something fragile. When she said, one cold February evening, that she was not afraid but she was thinking about her mother who had died of fever when Susan was 4, he sat down beside her and held her hand and said, "I know. I'm here. And we have Doc Henderson and Dolores and Mrs. Howell and half of Cimarron Wells who would walk through fire to help you." She laughed and rested her head on his shoulder. "I know," she said. "I know." The boy was born in March, just as the first edges of spring were appearing in the desert, early one morning while the ranch was still in its pre-dawn quiet and the oil lamps were lit against the dark. Doc Henderson was calm and competent, and Dolores was there with the particular authority of women who have attended births and know what is noise and what is urgency. And Albert sat outside the door in the hallway for 2 hours in a state of suppressed, controlled dread that only broke when he heard the cry, high and new and indignant, and Dolores opened the door and said, "A son. Both well. Come in." He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the sight of her. Susan, tired and radiant and entirely herself, with the bundle in her arms, and he crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, who was red-faced and deeply offended by everything so far, and he put his finger against the boy's small, tight fist, and the fist closed around it with the unconscious grip of the newborn. "Thomas," Susan said. It was not a question. She had decided weeks ago and told him, and he had agreed without needing to think about it. Thomas, he confirmed. She looked at him over the baby's head, and the look between them was everything the year and more had been. The road and the photograph and the promissory note and the debt and the evening on the porch and the morning walks and the cold December wedding and every ordinary meal and argument and quiet night between then and now. "We're all right," she said. "We're all right," he said. Thomas Kendrick Vaughan learned to walk the following spring, and was universally regarded as a person of great determination and very little patience, which his mother recognized as familiar qualities, and his father received with the equanimity of a man prepared to be outwitted on a regular basis. The ranch prospered through the early 1880s in the straightforward way of operations that are well managed and hard worked, and have the good fortune to be in the right place in a growing territory. Albert's boundary dispute with Denton had been formally resolved in his favor in 1879, and the fence was correctly placed, and Denton had not been pleasant about it, but had not been able to do anything about it, and the matter settled into the low-grade mutual avoidance of men in a small community who have concluded their antagonism. The ledger Susan kept became the backbone of the ranch's financial clarity, and on one occasion a neighboring rancher came to Albert for help with his own accounts, and Albert said with no particular fanfare that Susan was the person to talk to. And the rancher looked uncertain for a moment, and then sat down at the table with her, and found her to be the clearest financial mind he had encountered in the territory, and told people so, which added a small consulting practice to Susan's already full days, and which she conducted with the direct competence she brought to everything. Helen Marsh remained her closest friend in town, and their friendship had the particular depth of people who had been honest with each other from the beginning. They had coffee together twice a week and argued about everything from territorial politics to the proper management of households, and occasionally agreed completely, which surprised them both each time. In the fall of 1882, Susan was expecting again, and this time she carried the pregnancy with the confidence of someone who had done it before and knew her own body and trusted the people around her. The second birth was easier, or at any rate felt easier, which amounts to the same thing. A daughter this time, Clara, named after no one in particular but landed in by Susan one morning with the conviction of the right name settling into place. Clara arrived with the golden-brown eyes that were her father's most prominent feature, and which she deployed with devastating effect from approximately her third month of life. Thomas, who was 3½ and had definite opinions about his sovereignty as the only child, went through a period of renegotiation before arriving at an accommodation with his sister that involved him explaining things to her at great length and her listening with apparent interest, which worked well for both of them. Albert watched his children the way he watched things he loved, fully present, consistently attentive, undemonstrative in public and entirely warm in private. He taught Thomas to sit a horse at 4, the same age his mother had taught him, though he was patient about it in a way his mother had not always been. He was less certain about how to be with Clara at first, in the diffident way of fathers with daughters, and Susan found this endearing and also absolutely not something she was going to let persist. "She is a person," Susan told him one evening, mild but clear, "not a fragile article. Talk to her the way you talk to Thomas. She's a baby. She's a baby person." She paused. "You talk to me directly from the first day. Do the same for her and you'll be fine." He considered this with the seriousness he brought to practical advice and began the next day, and Clara, who was 8 months old and had opinions about everything regardless, responded to direct address with enthusiasm, and the question of how to be with her resolved itself as most questions about being with people resolve themselves, through the practice of actually showing up. The summer of 1883 brought a letter from an unexpected direction. It was from a man named Greer, who was the son of the witness on Harlan Vaughan's original promissory note, writing from somewhere in Colorado to say that his father had recently passed and had left behind a letter intended for Thomas Kendrick, not knowing that Thomas had also passed, and the son was forwarding it not knowing what else to do. The letter inside was old, written in 1874, and it was Harlan Vaughn addressing Thomas Kendrick directly. "I know what I owe you. I have not forgotten, and I am not proud of the fact that I have not acted. I have started this letter 5 times, and each time I find I cannot finish it because I cannot find words equal to the wrong. I am sending this to Greer with instructions that if I die without having made it right, he should find a way to see it reaches you so that you know at least that I carried it." The letter was not finished. It broke off mid-sentence. It had never been sent. Susan read it at the kitchen table with Albert across from her, and she read it twice and she set it down. "He knew," she said. "He knew," Albert said quietly. "He just couldn't." She looked at the old letter, the yellowed paper and the faded ink. "He just couldn't get there." She thought about her father, who had also never been able to ask for what was owed him, who had also carried the thing in silence rather than name it and demand its resolution. 2 men, parallel in their incapacity, the distance between them consisting of nothing more than pride and the particular paralysis that pride creates. 2 families affected by the space between what was owed and what was said. She folded the letter carefully. "I'm going to put this with the ledger," she said. Albert nodded. He understood why without needing to ask. She filed the letter behind the entry she had made, Thomas Kendrick, settled accounts. It seemed right that it should be there. That the whole story should be in one place. The debt and the fault and the acknowledgement and the old unsent letter from the man who could not find the words, and the resolution that had come through his son, who could. The years built on one another in the way that good years do, unhurriedly, and with a cumulative weight that is only clear when you stop and look back. Cimarron Wells grew, as the territorial towns were growing in those years, slowly acquiring the infrastructure of permanence. A school, a larger church, a doctor's office that was not in the man's house, a second hotel. The railroad was talked about as something that might come through within the decade, and people argued about whether it would be good or not in the way that people argue about changes they cannot stop. Albert expanded the ranch carefully, buying the parcel to the north when the previous owner decided to return east, adding cattle and horses with the deliberate long-term thinking that had always characterized his management. He hired 2 new cowhands and kept the same ones who had been there for years, and the operation was known in the territory as well-run and fair to the men who worked it. Thomas started at the new school in Cimarron Wells in 1885 and came home the first day with the news that arithmetic was his least favorite thing, and that a boy named Clem had pushed him off the water barrel. He delivered these 2 pieces of information in his mother's practical, sequential way, and Albert, after a moment of father's instinct that Susan watched him set aside, said very calmly, "What did you do when he pushed you?" Thomas said he had gotten back up and looked at the boy without saying anything. Albert nodded with the particular nod of a man approving an approach. "Good start," he said. "Keep watching. People tell you who they are." Thomas considered this with the focused attention of a child receiving information he understood was actually important. "Like you told me about the horses," he said. "Just like that," Albert said. Susan watched this exchange from the kitchen doorway and felt the particular feeling that came over her sometimes in ordinary moments, the feeling of the story of her life being itself, actual and present and better than she had known to imagine. Clara started school 2 years after Thomas, and proved herself to be, as everyone who had observed her closely had expected, a person of enormous intellectual appetite and significant independence of opinion. She and her mother argued regularly and productively, and with great mutual respect, and Thomas mediated these arguments with the patient, explanatory style he had developed with Clara in infancy, which still worked with her at 7 in a way that it worked with no one else. In the spring of 1887, Susan was working late in the sitting room, the one with the good morning light that had less morning light now, because they had put up a trellis outside the window that was growing something green and pleasant, when Albert came and stood in the doorway. He was 40 years old that spring, which sat on him well, the lines at his eyes and the gray beginning at his temples a kind of settling into himself that she found more attractive than his younger face had been, though she would not have said it was possible to improve on that either. He stood in the doorway with his arms folded and watched her work for a moment. "Thomas wants to start working with the cattle this summer," he said. "He's 9, she said. "I started at 9. "You were also 9 in a situation where there was no choice." She did not say this critically. It was simply the fact. "He wants to," Albert said. "He's been asking for 2 weeks." She looked up from the ledger. "Ask him if he wants to because it interests him or because he thinks it's what he's supposed to want." Albert considered this. "That's a good question. I've been told I ask good questions." He smiled from the doorway. "By who?" "By you, regularly." He came into the room and sat on the small footstool near her desk, which was not designed for a man his size but which he used anyway. And they talked about Thomas and what he might be suited for and what he might want from his life. And this conversation was one of hundreds of its kind they had had about both children, the long, attentive project of knowing their children rather than just directing them. Thomas did work that summer with the cattle, under the supervision of a hand named Joe who had the patience and the teaching instinct, and Thomas loved it in the way that turned out to be genuine rather than obligatory, and continued it the next summer and the one after. The remaining debt had been fully discharged years earlier. The promissory note was filed in the ledger with the final receipt and Albert's note of acknowledgement, the full sequence of the thing laid out in clean record. The $4,000 had become $6,400 and then been paid in full, and now it was simply history, a piece of the story rather than an obligation. But the story was the thing. Susan thought one autumn evening in 1887, sitting on the front porch with the last of the light going orange over the western hills and the sound of Thomas and Clara arguing about something in the yard below, and Albert coming out to sit beside her with 2 cups of coffee. The story was what her father had given her, not the ranch, which was gone, not the money, which had been taken. The story of a man who had been fair and trusted when he should have been trusted in return, and who had raised a daughter who could walk into a difficult situation alone and find her way through it. She had walked in with a photograph and a promissory note and $40 and her father's quiet conviction that the world should correct itself. The world in its way had, not neatly, not without detour, but here was the correction. This porch, this man beside her, these children in the yard below, this life built on the cleared ground where the old debt had been resolved and acknowledged and paid. "What are you thinking?" Albert asked in the way he sometimes asked, the way that meant he was actually asking and would actually listen. "About my father," she said, "about how he would see all this." "What would he see?" She looked at the hills and the light and the children below. "His investment," she said and smiled. "All of it returned." Albert laughed softly and reached over and took her hand, the same way he had on the porch the evening before he first kissed her, and they sat together in the autumn evening with the coffee and the last of the light, and the ranch around them and the town, a half-mile distant and the whole wide territory beyond that, the red rock and the sage and the enormous sky that had no equivalent anywhere, and all of it present and real and entirely, completely theirs. Thomas came running up from the yard with the particular urgency of a 9-year-old delivering news. A coyote had been seen at the edge of the north pasture, and should someone go look, was the question. And Albert set down his coffee and said he would go check in a moment, and Thomas should go tell Joe. And Thomas ran back with the speed of someone given an official errand, and Clara followed at a more dignified pace, and Susan watched them go and felt the fullness of the moment settle in the way that fullness does when you have come far enough from the start of a story to see its whole shape. She had come to this territory with a worn photograph and a legal document and a grief she was carrying in every direction. She had found what she came for and more than she came for, and the more was everything. The debt that her father had been too proud to demand, that Harlan Vaughn had been too proud to pay, that had sat between two families for 11 years like something unfinished, was finished. The son had been different from the father. The daughter had been different from the father. Two people better at the thing their fathers could not do, which was to face the wrong and name it and correct it. And in the correction, something neither of their fathers could have predicted. This particular life, this ranch in the high desert, this family made of two people who had come to each other across a debt and found something richer than repayment. The light went fully and the first stars appeared, faint at first and then certain, and Albert stood and said he'd go check on the coyote situation, and she said to take Thomas with him, which he did, and she heard them in the yard, the man's voice and the boy's voice. And Clara came and sat beside her and leaned against her arm the way Clara did sometimes in the evenings, the composed, independent child finding the moment for quiet closeness, and Susan held her daughter in the falling dark. The stars came out fully overhead, the same stars she had traveled under when she first came to this country, the same enormous sky. She looked up at them and thought about the promissory note in the ledger and her father's name in the settled accounts column and the old unsent letter from Harlan Vaughn filed behind it, all the unspoken things now spoken, all the unnamed things named, all the debts paid. She was no longer running. She was entirely, at last, arrived.